Happy Friday, everyone. I wanted to come on and discuss a couple of interesting things that I saw in the high yield deals that came out this week. Now, these are just the ones that I happen to have time to look at and just a few of the things that I picked up. So the first one I wanted to look at was Befimmo, which is a debut issuer and clearly has some concerns around the cash trap mechanism in its um, facilities that um, finance its operations at the property level. So the risk factors, as I've said many times, have a treasure trove of information. There will always be something about the issuer being a holding company because in all of these cases, the issuer is a holding company. But if there's anything relevant about the issuer's ability to receive cash from the restricted group, it will be in this particular risk factor. So as we can see, there is a provision here that discusses how amounts available to the issuer will depend on profitability and cash flows, and also terms of any financing arrangements and contracts that may restrict their ability to pay or distribute such amounts. So given what happened in Thames Water, this sort of flagged in my mind and I wanted to read more about it. So this always will tell you other places you can go to get more information. Just to give you a little more clarity on what I'm thinking on Thames Water, there was obviously a whole business securitization which prevented dividends from being distributed up to the EMTN. And it was just in my mind because I did a session for GLG this week on Thames Water and happen to be reading this document around the same time. So if you want to read a little bit more about this, it will tell you where to go. And we can just go here to the risk factor that's cross-referred, and it talks about existing facilities that contain covenants restricting dividends and cash trap mechanisms, etc. And then it also does say that as of the end of last year, no cash generated would be subject to such mechanisms, which is obviously good to know. Now, I've marked lots of things here for students of Fox Legal Training. I'm just going to highlight a few things in particular that relate to this issue. There is a letter of credit to cover any interest shortfall, and there's lots of disclosure about how that works and the unfunded amount being the required amount as between any cash deposits provided by the issuer and the letter of credit. So this is all really helpful disclosure in that regard, and I do think kind of gives you some comfort that they have prepared for the, possibility that the cash trap mechanisms in those facilities could be triggered. In the description of other indebtedness section, there will be more information about how the cash trap mechanisms work, so you can run some calculations and see how likely you think it might be that they would be triggered. Would obviously recommend that anyone investing in this deal do that. The other interesting thing about this deal is that it is a debut issuer, so it gives us a little bit of an idea where terms are at the moment, because debut issuers are never going to want to come to the market with terms that are going to get knocked back. So they will market with what would be considered kind of market terms. So one thing I felt notable there was the 10% at 103, which in my view tends to be a sort of toppy term. But I do think, market is hot, so folks are getting this one in. It's a really valuable option for the issuer, obviously. And then the other point I wanted to make was around the restricted payments covenant. Um, which is after all my highlighting on the debt covenant. So here's limitation on restricted payments. The definition of restricted payment comes first, and then conditions to using the builder basket is second, builder basket is third. So we've got a default blocker, which is great. We've got the kind of ratio test equivalent for this deal, which is based on net total loan to value ratio. And then here we have that that this condition won't apply if the borrower is using the starter amount. So the borrower can access the starter amount even if they can't meet their net total loan to value ratio, which I think is interesting because I've seen that in a few deals, and it seems to be a kind of new market standard for this provision that borrowers can access starter amounts for various things even if they can't comply with these conditions. So then we have this builder baskets based on 50% CNI. Here is the start date, first day of the financial quarter in which the issue date occurs, absolutely as we'd expect it to be. And then here, with no amount taken into account, will be less than zero for this paragraph. So what that's saying is that while the builder will build at 50% of consolidated net income, it will not reduce based on any losses that take it below zero. I don't actually even see the typical language here that would say that it reduces by losses at all. So I'm wondering if that maybe means that it's only reduced by 50% of losses. But normally the provision would work that it bills by 50% of losses, reduces by 100% of losses. Um, and that's the kind of bog standard from the baby lawyer days, but it has evolved this provision quite a lot. And in many, many deals, it does not allow the provision to go below zero, which means the borrower could have losses, stops at zero, don't have to recoup the losses to get back up into a positive state in this basket. So just another one that I thought was interesting. And then coming together with the restricted payments and the funded amount, I note that the builder basket is blocked when the funded amount is less than the required amount. So there's some interplay between the ability of the borrower to pay dividends and the ability of the borrower to pay interest on bonds, which I think is entirely appropriate and great to see. So moving on to Fedrigoni, which was another deal that I looked at this week for Fox Legal Training students, and I wrote in a blog about the magic of a black line. So when you run a legal black line between two deals, and I tend to do this when you've got a refinancing or a borrower that's a repeat issuer, to pick up changes from one deal to the next, you can pick up lots of things that would be very difficult to find if you were just comparing the deals, kind of by sight. So it's going to pull up all of the things that are different, which is why you see lots and lots of redlining around definitions and things. That's not really what I think is so interesting. But what I will say is going back to that 10% at 103 again, you can see that the borrower has added one here. So this black line is in comparison to the notes that they issued in January. So the issuance in January and these notes, you would expect to be more or less the same. Any changes the borrower is making between these two sets of notes are going to be very intentional. They're doing it for a reason because it was only a few months ago that they made the other issuance. So it can reflect a change in the market. The market may be better now than it was in January. And in this case, that 10% of 103 is really a bellwether for a kind of toppy market. And here we have one. The January deal does not have one. They also added an equity clause. So 40% of notes can be taken out with the proceeds of an equity offering. Now, remember, the definition of equity offering includes debt security. So we're not just talking about equity. And it has the language that will allow the borrower, this language highlighted here, will allow the borrower to combine the redemption price of the equity clause with a make whole in the event of an LBO or other transaction that will require all the bonds to come out. So the January notes don't have this, which means that the January bonds have a stronger protection of upside than these May issued bonds have. And I'd be interested to see if that's reflected at all in the trading price. Just an interesting one to keep in mind. And then I also wanted to note, because we have these issues with Altice and the backdated builder basket, we're looking at the restricted payments covenant. Hang on, just get to restricted payments covenant. Here we go. What we have here, so again, restricted payments covenant, just to make that clear, is a comparison of the two restricted payments covenants. Again, would expect this to be more or less the same. Now, here is the builder basket start date, sorry, which is actually here. And it refers to the original issue date rather than the first day of the fiscal quarter in which the issue date occurs, which is the language you would typically expect to see. So you can also see that the January notes referred back to the existing notes issue date. Now these bonds are taking out the notes that they are referring to, the issue date of the notes they're referring to. So I'm just going to go into original issue date means. I also highlighted this, but I just want to kind of show, well, obviously not that easy, but how easy it can be to find these just by using Control F. So original issue date means, I'm not sure why I didn't pick that up, but October 22nd, 2022. So that means that these bonds are preserving build-up basket capacity from that date to now, which I have no sort of opinion on apart from there's no disclosure in the offering memorandum as to what that built-up capacity is. So as I wrote in the blog for Fox Legal Training, which you can get on our website, it feels a little bit like a hidden basket. Like you wouldn't really expect the borrower to have a basket in its OM, which is kind of like, here's a basket that has some capacity in it, but we're not going to tell you what it is. This is standard. This is not just, isolated to Fedrigoni. This is when they're backdated builder baskets in Europe, you hardly ever see disclosure about what the built-up capacity is. You see it sometimes in the US, which I think is much more appropriate from a transparency perspective. And I would really love to see that kind of disclosure here. But it also brings up that question, and I know there are differences in opinion here amongst practitioners about whether it's appropriate to refer back to a start date for a build-up basket in a bond that no longer is outstanding. I personally think you should either port it into a new basket so the disclosure is very clear around what amount is there, or put the build-up basket in line with bonds that are still outstanding. So in this case, it would be in line with the bonds outstanding in January. That would mean the borrower would lose some of its built-up capacity from an earlier date. Arguable whether that's justified. Obviously, at the end of the day, this is all contractual negotiation. And as I'm now coming to the end of the video, I need to put in that typical disclaimer that none of this is investment advice or legal advice. If you would like that, get in touch with your relevant professional. If you would like to find out more about Fox Legal Training's online legal training platform, get in touch with me. If you have any questions about these deals or you'd like me to look at another issue for any other deal, let me know. And there's just one more thing I wanted to point out, as I did hear this week that there was a carve out from a company called Zayo, which is a US telecoms company, or I guess they do have global operations, but they're carving out some of their operations. And this did kind of, ring some bells for people, given that Altice has done at similar kind of moving entities into, out of the restricted group. So it's something I'll keep an eye on, and folks want me to look at any provisions in relation to that. I'm very happy to do that. As you know, I do love lies and covenants. So with that, I wish everyone a wonderful weekend. I hope you enjoy the glorious sunshine that we're expecting, and that is, as you can see here now, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks, everybody.